I welcome everyone, for those of you who I've not seen here before, to the second annual Spring Conference, sponsored by the Center for the Study of World Religions here at Harvard Divinity School. This year's theme, as you probably know already, is Studying Religions Across the Disciplines. I'm Ann Monius. I'm the acting director of the Center for the current academic year. In some ways, eagerly looking forward to June 30th when I hand back the reins, but this has been one of the events that I've been most excited about here. I'd like to begin, first of all, and perhaps not surprisingly, thanking a number of people. In particular, first, I'd like to thank all of our presenters who have come from afar to share their work with us, all of those who have traveled no further than across the yard or across the River Charles to join us, and also to my few colleagues and especially graduate students among us here in religious studies who have agreed to formally respond to papers that very often, more often than not, actually lay quite far outside their intellectual comfort zones. I'd also like to thank, and this is truly heartfelt from the depths of my heart, I'd like to thank the staff here at the Center for the Study of World Religions, particularly Lexi Gewertz. Those of you who are participating, stand up here, Lexi, so everyone knows who you are. Who is our Director for Educational Programming, Matthew Whitaker. Is Matthew here? Or is he at the back desk? Back out at the front desk doing his thing. Who's our staff assistant, and then our two always reliable, always fun to work with student assistants, Megan and Emily. Emily down here in the red, who will be busily transcribing the proceedings. I have to thank them all for handling so capably, so ably, all of the complex logistics that go into putting on any conference. And what I'm particularly grateful for is that at least 99.9% of the time they do it with a big smile on their faces. Again, I'm only doing this job for a year, filling in my colleague Frank Clooney is on leave. And it's been such a pleasure working with Lexi, Matthew, and the entire staff. I really can't thank them enough. And of course, a real heartfelt thanks to all of you who've come out today on a cold, windy, blustery day to see where all of this might lead. This conference is, in short, as I envision it, something of an experiment. Very much an experiment that I hope is very much in keeping, and I would certainly argue that it is, with the experiment that is the center itself where we're all gathered. We're in the common room right now at the Center for the Study of World Religions. The Center for the Study of World Religions was originally endowed in 1959 on the proposition that one might learn a lot about other religious traditions if one actually met scholars from within those traditions and began a conversation with them. This was a radical idea in 1959 that religious knowledge of the religions of the world might move forward over coffee in the common room, in someone's living room in one of our residents, in the kitchen, or down by the laundry machines in the basement, where I myself have had several interesting conversations with the residents this year. The anonymous donors who so generously provided the funds to actually build the building, with its residential units, its common spaces, its libraries, research areas upstairs, and offices, believed wholeheartedly that nothing short of face-to-face conversation could really jumpstart new, rigorous scholarly inquiry across religious, sectarian, ethical, intellectual, and other human divides. And while religion has been studied in many disciplines over the past century and a half, and it has, one might say that interest in religion has really busted out all over the place, like never before, across the university here and across the nation, in the wake of the tragic events of 9/11. Religion is being addressed in virtually every school, at every university and college in the country these days, and enrollments in classes dealing with religion and politics, religion and ethics, religion and law, religion and business, religion and fill in whatever blank you'd like, have soared over the past decade and a half. Yet so much of this study, whether we think of faculty research, student learning, teaching, goes on still in relative disciplinary isolation. As the founders of the center envisioned a half-century ago, that Christians meeting Buddhists and Muslims for the first time can and actually should try to find a way to speak to each other in mutually intelligible and productive ways, so too is this conference organized in the hope that one, mutually intelligible conversation is indeed possible across disciplinary lines, two, that meeting face-to-face might be a good place to start, And that 3, such conversation may well actually enhance the work we all do when we go back to our distinct disciplinary quarters of the university. I've had the pleasure and the real privilege of reading all of the papers to come in advance, and it's genuinely a truly exciting prospect to think about the ways in which we might begin to talk about among ourselves about religion, despite our very distinct vocabularies. That's become clearer and clearer to me as I read through the papers, our particular modes of argumentation, forms of evidence, habits of discursive practice, and, as I've come to realize quite hilariously at times, different expectations of conferences. I've spent the last 3 decades of my life studying the religious traditions of medieval South India from a distinctly humanities perspective that one might loosely characterize as religion and literature. And the conference proceedings will be made available on my website in both Sanskrit and Tamil verse by Monday morning. The best work in my rather obscure corner of religious and South Asian studies has long looked to the insights, theoretical and practical, of those who toil in other more robustly evidenced academic fields, from medieval European studies to literary and political theory derived from Euro-American source material. The ongoing lack of consensus in religious studies about how to engage those who study religion in other disciplines, indeed, since 9/11, whether to even try to engage them, has, I confess, been to me deeply mystifying. To quote my favorite country song from childhood, it seems to me at best that the recent impetus to circle the wagons and pass out the guns, those who die will be the lucky ones, to protect some vaguely demarcated turf we institutionalize as the Religious Studies Department, or here the Committee on the Study of Religion or the Divinity School, smacks of arrogance, and that's at its best. At worst, it seems inevitably self-defeating in the long run. Whether or not any argument can or should be made, should be reached across academic disciplines as to the nature of religion and the range of possibilities for responsibly studying it, only through careful and respectful attention to the myriad ways in which religion is currently being studied and taught across the spectrum of the university will we ever be able to articulate clearly the specific contributions that the humanities in general and religious studies in particular can make. This conference in a nutshell, then, is thus an initial attempt to foster a lasting conversation among scholars studying religion across the disciplines of the humanities, social sciences, and hard sciences, not only here at Harvard, but in the greater Boston area and around and nationally as well. Here at Harvard, from my vantage point, conversations among various faculties on the topic of religion, what it is, how it should be studied, remain very much in their infancy, and to be perfectly honest, sometimes I fear much more so than at other institutions. The 3-day conference draws scholars from around the university. We have people from the Div School, the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, many departments, the Law School, the Kennedy School of Government, for sustained conversations with colleagues from the Boston area and from around the country. In order to facilitate discussions that are simultaneously somewhat focused and hopefully also capacious enough to invite genuine interdisciplinary exchange, the conference has been organized as a series of panels on topics that have in one way or another been of long-standing interest to scholars of religion, working within the disciplines of the humanities, but that also signal potentially fertile topics of conversations with scientists, historians of science, legal scholars, and scholars of economics, business, and government. The focus throughout, I very much hope, will be on translation, for lack of a better term, on efforts to find common basis of inquiry, common or at least mutually comprehensible vocabularies, and sustainable relationships that I endure, I hope, beyond this conference proper. I'm willing to admit, ever the realist, that it may not work, or that any work that the conference really does might not be immediately obvious in the formal discussions. Indeed, if much of the real stuff of the conference happens during coffee breaks or over a meal or a drink, then ever the optimist, I'll be willing to call it something of a success. Hopefully, very much I hope, that we'll be able to get together again, joined by a common interest in understanding religious people and religious phenomena, even if we have to struggle a bit initially to find a way to talk about our shared interests. We have panels on a number of topics over the course of the next 2 days, including tomorrow morning, Religion, Ethics, and Psychology from 9:30 to 11:30, all of them are here. Religion, Rights, and Ethics, 2 to 4 tomorrow. Religion and Economy, 4:30 to 6:30. And on Saturday morning, for those of you with real stamina, Religion, Religious Law, and Secular Law from 9:30 to 11:30. We begin this afternoon, however, with a panel on religion, experience, and the neurological sciences. And what I'm going to do for each of the panels is simply introduce to you at one fell swoop the speakers as well as the respondents, so as not to have to get up and interrupt the proceedings once they begin. Our first presenter, to my right here, will be Cheryl Chen. Professor Chen received her BA from Amherst College and her PhD in philosophy from the University of California at Berkeley. She was an assistant professor at Bryn Mawr College before coming to Harvard in 2006. She works primarily in epistemology and the philosophy of mind. Her other interests include the philosophy of religion, the history of philosophy, metaphysics, and applied ethics. Her research concerns the relation between perceptual experience and empirical content. Recently, she has also been working on the relation between self-identification and bodily awareness, the transparency of belief, and the use of transcendental arguments against certain forms of subjectivism. Our second speaker, to my right, Dr. Edward Modestino, was raised as a Zen Buddhist in a Zen Buddhist environment and educated as a neuroscientist. At this point in his life, he's trying to bridge the divide between the two. His career in neuroscience has focused on using neuroimaging and electrophysiology as tools to study cognition, attention, and perception, with a particular interest in altered states of consciousness and religious experience. He is working on IBCSR's Neuroscience and Religion Cognition project as a postdoctoral research fellow in functional neuroimaging and the scientific study of religion. Additionally, he is a research assistant professor of neuroscience and religious cognition at Boston University. Our two respondents, to my left, are first Mara Bloch. Mara is a PhD candidate in the study of religion at Harvard University and is a researcher on religion, medicine, and sexuality for the Science, Religion, and Culture program at Harvard Divinity School. She is writing a dissertation about pastoral counseling, psychiatry, and sexuality in mid-20th century America. Our second respondent is Professor David Lamberth. Professor Lamberth is professor of philosophy and theology here at the Divinity School, where he teaches a range of courses in Western theology and philosophy of religion that emphasize modern liberal thought and probe the interconnections between theological and philosophical reflection in American and continental thought. He joined the faculty in 1997 as an assistant professor after spending 2 years at Florida State University, and he served as a 3-year term as Associate Dean for Academic Affairs here from 2000 to 2003. His 1999 book, William James and the Metaphysics of Experience, exhibits his interest in the revival of pragmatism and demonstrates the inherent engagement with religion in James's philosophical system, as well as James's pluralism. He's currently working on 2 books. The first, Religion, A Pragmatic Approach, which analyzes both historical contemporary treatments of religion and the pragmatic tradition, and a second volume on William James for the Routledge Philosophers series. Other research interests include religious experience and the construction of the field of philosophy of religion in modernity. He also chaired, by the way, for those of you who are locals, Harvard University's library reform effort for the Office of the Provost. So if you've got issues after the talk, you know who to ask. So please join me in welcoming both our presenters and our respondents. So without further ado, I give you Professor Chen.
Thank you for your kind introduction and for inviting me to this wonderful conference. Okay, so today, actually I should first mention that there's a handout that is outside the door, if anybody didn't get it.
If you raise your hand, I'll give you one.
Okay. All right, so today I'm going to focus on cases of religious experience where the person having the experience describes it as an experience of God, right? So in these sorts of cases, a subject describes being conscious or directly aware of God. And I have some sort of canonical examples, the sorts of examples everybody gives in this kind of context. So first from St. Teresa, she says, "I was at a prayer on a festival of the glorious St. Peter when I saw Christ at my side, or to put it better, I was conscious of him, for neither with the eyes of the body nor with those of the soul did I see anything. I thought he was quite close to me, and I saw that it was he who, as I thought, was speaking to me." And another from an account of a subject in William James's Varieties of Religious Experience. "All at once, I felt the presence of God. I tell of the thing just as I was conscious of it, as if his goodness and his power were penetrating me altogether. Then slowly the ecstasy left my heart, that is, I felt that God had withdrawn the communion which he had granted. I asked myself if it were possible that Moses could have had a more intimate communication with God. I think it well to add that in this ecstasy of mine, God had neither form, color, odor, nor taste. Moreover, that the feeling of his presence was accompanied by no determinate localization. But the more I seek words to express this intimate intercourse, the more I feel the impossibility of describing a thing by and of our usual images. A bodily expression most apt to render what I felt is this: God was present, though invisible. He felt under no one of my senses, yet my consciousness perceived him. So some philosophers of religion propose to take these sorts of descriptions at face value. Right? So when someone has this kind of religious experience, she may actually be perceiving God. Right? And so these philosophers argue that religious experiences can justify religious belief in the same way that ordinary sensory experiences can justify beliefs about the perceiver's immediate environment. Right? So here's a typical quote from William James. He says, "Our own more rational beliefs are based on evidence exactly similar in nature to which mystics quote for theirs. Our senses, namely, have assured us of certain states of fact. But mystical experiences are as direct perceptions of fact for those who have them as any sensations were for us. The records show that even though the five senses be in abeyance in them, they're absolutely sensational in their epistemological quality, if I may be pardon the barbarous expression. That is, they are face-to-face presentations of what seems immediately to exist." So, suppose I'm looking at a table in front of me, right? My eyes are open, the lighting is normal, and I see a bowl of fruit, right? So this experience, we generally think, gives me reason. It justifies my belief that there's a bowl of fruit on the table, right? I know that there's a bowl of fruit on the table on the basis of my experience. So in the same way, these philosophers argue, when someone has the right kind of religious experience, it could give the person reason to believe that God exists. It provides her with warrant for her religious belief. I should point out here, in the interest of simplicity, I'm phrasing all of this in a kind of monotheistic Judeo-Christian terminology, but what I say here is meant to apply equally well to the sorts of religious experiences people have in the context of other traditions. Okay, so now some other philosophers object that religious experiences cannot rationally support religious belief unless certain other alternatives are ruled out. So we need to rule out, for example, that the possibility that the experience is due to some kind of hallucination, right? So in other words, we have two hypotheses to consider. I have this on the handout. The first, I call H1, experience is caused by God. The second is that the experience has some other psychological cause within the subject, right? Maybe a hallucination. So the thought is here, a religious experience isn't going to give you warrant for the relevant kind of belief in God unless you have reason to accept H1 over H2, right? Now, in ordinary circumstances, or non-philosophical circumstances, there are two methods we might use for deciding between two hypotheses, right? First, we might reason inductively, right, based on, correlations that we've observed in the past, right? Second, we might reason by inference to the best explanation, right? By considering which hypothesis gives us the best or simplest explanation of the data. Now, neither type of reasoning is going to be particularly promising in the case of religious experience if we're trying to argue for H1 over H2. Consider induction first, right? The correlations in this case would have to be between certain kinds of religious experience on the one hand and the actual presence of God on the other, right? But to observe that correlation, you already have to be in a position to observe God, right? And that's exactly what's at issue, right? Are these kinds of experiences observations of God in the first place, right? Second, consider arguments from the best explanation. It's not obvious that positing God as the cause of a particular religious experience is going to give you a simpler or better explanation of the experience than positing some kind of psychological cause. In fact, things like Occam's razor are usually brought in to argue, against religious hypotheses, right? Okay, so that's one objection, right? Now, some philosophers respond to that objection, right, by noting that we actually face the same kinds of problems in the case of ordinary sensory experience, right? So let's return to my, example of the experience of the bowl of fruit on the table in front of me, right? So there are two hypotheses here. One is the experience I'm having is caused by the bowl of fruit, right? And the second is that, maybe my experience is caused in some other way. Maybe I'm dreaming, or it's caused by a computer hooked up to my disembodied brain, right? So this is a classical skeptical scenario that philosophers love to talk about, right? So suppose you don't have a body or just a disembodied brain floating in a vat of nutrients, and all your experiences are fed directly into your brain by a very sophisticated computer. So it seems to you as if you're sitting here in this conference when in fact you're actually just a disembodied brain floating in a vat, right? Okay, so that's H2. So the skeptic, right, argues that my experience can't give me warrant for my belief that there's a bowl of fruit in front of me unless I can rule out this skeptical hypothesis, H2, right? But what reason do I have for believing in H1 over H2? It's not clear I can reason inductively, right? I can't appeal to correlations between my sensory experiences and what's happening in the mind-independent world unless I already have knowledge of the mind-independent world, right? And that's exactly the knowledge that the skeptic is questioning, right? Nor is it clear that this is controversial, that H1 gives us a better or simpler explanation than H2. Okay, so this is, the classic problem of the external world, right? And it's been plaguing us for centuries, ever since Descartes introduced the evil genius, in the Meditations, right? Okay, but you get the idea, right? So, if we have to eliminate alternative hypotheses, right, we're no better off in the ordinary experience case than we are in the case of religious experience, right? Okay, so what I'd like to do now is look at two different theories of perceptual experience that sort of try to respond to the traditional problem of external world skepticism and see to what extent they might apply to the case of religious experience, right? So the first view I'd like to look at is called dogmatism. And this is a view that was made recently popular by a philosopher at NYU named Jim Pryor, and who based it on some work of G.E. Moore. Okay, so the dogmatist claims that perceptual experience just gives us immediate prima facie justification for our beliefs. So on this view, I don't need to first rule out the brain in the vat hypothesis, right, or any of the other kinds of skeptical hypotheses, in order for my experience of the bowl of fruit to justify my belief that there's a bowl of fruit in front of me. The experience just immediately justifies the belief, unless I have some positive reason to suspect the belief is false or that the experience shouldn't be trusted, right? So that's to say, experiences give us sort of defeasible justification for our beliefs. They justify our beliefs so long as there's no defeaters, right? Now, there are two types of defeaters to be on the lookout for. There are undercutting defeaters and rebutting defeaters. Now, an undercutting defeater is evidence that the experience in question is untrustworthy, right? So suppose I see what looks like a pink piece of paper in front of me, right? If I also had evidence that somebody had changed all the light bulbs to, red light bulbs, right? That would be an undercutting defeater for my belief that the paper in front of me is pink, right? It undermines it suggests that the experience is untrustworthy in some way. A rebutting defeater is evidence that the belief in question is just false, right? So suppose I have an experience of in which it looks like my grandfather is in the doorway, right? My knowledge that my grandfather passed away 10 years ago, right, would be a rebutting defeater, be evidence that, that my grandfather's not in the doorway, right? Okay, so, right, so the idea, the dogmatist wants to say, if you're having a perceptual experience, provided there are no defeaters like that, right, you're just automatically justified at taking that experience at face value, and the belief you base on that experience is justified. And an advantage of this view is it shifts the burden of proof back over to the skeptic, right? So we don't first have to prove to the skeptic that we're not brains in a vat, right, in order to have knowledge about our immediate surroundings based on our experience, right? Instead, the burden on of proof is on the skeptic, right, to give us evidence that suggests that we are brains in the vat, or that our experiences are in some way trustworthy, right, or that the external world does not exist, right? And, no such evidence is really going to be forthcoming unless, we're in the Matrix movie or something like that. Okay, so let's apply this picture to the case of religious experience. So here we might say, as dogmatists, religious experience can justify a person's religious belief, provided there are no defeaters, right? So again, the burden of proof shifts over to the religious skeptic, right, to give us a positive reason for thinking that religious experiences are untrustworthy, or that the beliefs that result from such experiences are false, right? So then we thought as well, what kinds of defeaters, right, might there be in this kind of case? Well, for undercutting defeaters, maybe we might look for evidence that the person is hallucinating. Has the person taken some kind of drug? Is there an epileptic seizure involved, right? Signs of schizophrenia. Notice, though, our position now is not all that different from what it was when at the beginning, when the religious skeptic insisted that we have to rule out these alternative hypotheses, H2, before we can take the experience to provide warrant for belief. Okay, as far as rebutting defeaters is concerned, we'd have a rebutting defeater if we had positive evidence that suggests that God doesn't exist, right? And so here the discussion turns to all sorts of fun topics that you might encounter in a intro philosophy of religion course like the one I teach, right? So is there a conflict between religion and science, right? Is the theistic conception of God coherent? And is our God's various attributes, say omnipotence and benevolence, right, compatible with one another? Does the existence of religious disagreement undermine the justification for religious belief? That sort of thing, right? So those kinds of things might be rebutting defeaters. Now we can argue about whether these actually are defeaters, right? So after all, some religious traditions consider hallucinogenic drugs, right, to be a kind of gateway to the spiritual realm, right? And lots of theists presumably think that there are no rebutting defeaters for the belief in the existence of God, right? They'll argue, no, the attributes of God are coherent, right? But the fact that there are some plausible, that we have some plausible defeaters, right, here, makes the case of religious experience a bit different from the case of ordinary perceptual experience, right? In ordinary perceptual experience, normally, I don't have any serious, non-fanciful, reasons for thinking that my experience is untrustworthy, or that, there is no external world, right? Okay, so that's dogmatism. I'd like to end by looking at another account of perceptual experience that has recently been popular in philosophical circles. And it might also have interesting applications to the special case of religious experience. So this view is called disjunctivism. And the reason for the name will become clear in a little bit. So the disjunctivist argues that the skeptical argument, right, in the case of ordinary perceptual experience, brain in the vat, that sort of thing, it gets off the ground because it takes for granted a certain traditional conception of perceptual experience. And it's a conception that's very tempting, but they think is ultimately misguided. So again, let's return to my experience of the bowl of fruit. We can distinguish here between the good case, right, where my senses are functioning normally, and there's a bowl of fruit actually in front of me, lighting is good, and the bad case where I'm hallucinating or dreaming, I'm a brain in the vat. Now it seems at least possible for the experience I have in the bad case to be indistinguishable from the experience I have in the good case. While actual hallucinations aren't generally indistinguishable from normal experience. I mean, we can at least imagine a hallucination that's so vivid and realistic that you could be taken in, right? Now, the traditional view of perception concludes from this that, well, all we are ever directly aware of in experience is what's common to the good case and the indistinguishable bad case, right? So this is sometimes called the greatest common factor view, right? So that's all we really get in experience, what those two cases have in common, right? And now since in the bad case, there is no bowl of fruit in front of me, right? Maybe I don't even have a body, I'm just brain into that. Then we have to say that even, so that's the bad case, even in the good case, I'm not directly experiencing a bowl of fruit either, right? Because I'm not in the bad case, so not in the good case either, right? Rather, what I directly experience is some kind of image or sense datum, right? From which I infer that there's a bowl of fruit in front of me, right? And now the external world skeptic gets a foothold by focusing on whether that inference is justified, right? So here's an analogy I like to use in this context. Like, suppose for a moment that you're raised in a locked, windowless room with nothing else but a bank of, TV screens along the wall, like Best Buy or something. And how would you know whether the images, there are all sorts of things going on the TV screen. How would you know that the images on the screen accurately represent what's happening outside of the room, right? And the skeptic's going to argue that we're exactly in the same boat when it comes to our ordinary perceptual experiences, right? We're locked in a room, in our heads. Okay, now the disjunctivist proposes that we just reject this traditional picture, right? Instead, what we should say is that the experiences we have in the good case are sort of fundamentally different from the experiences we have in the bad case. So in the good case, we're not locked in a room. We're immediately aware. We're directly confronted with the objects in our environment, right? So when I'm in the good case, looking at a bowl of fruit in good light, the fact that there's a bowl of fruit in front of me is directly presented to me. I don't infer that it's there, as a traditional view would have it. I just see that it's there, right? And some disjunctivists spell this out by saying that perception's a relational state, right? The object that you perceive is an essential constituent of the perceptual experience, right? So really, you can't have that experience unless the thing is really there, right? So because of this, disjunctivists, or some of them, they'll say that if I'm in the good case, right, I'm thereby just justified in holding the corresponding belief, right? And unlike the dogmatist, this justification isn't, the disjunctivist thinks that my warrant, my justification for the belief is indefeasible, right? That's to say, I'm not merely justified in believing, say, that there's a bowl in front of me in the absence of defeaters. Rather, if I'm actually in the good case, it just entails that I know that there's a bowl of fruit in front of me. Okay, so disjunctivists generally don't have too much to say about the bad case, right? So, so basically they just say, well, in the bad case, when you're hallucinating, like something entirely different is going on, right? Despite the fact that it might be indistinguishable from the good case, right? Their point is just that we shouldn't infer from the fact that the bad case might be indistinguishable. We shouldn't infer from that all we get in the good case, right, is something that's in common to both, right? Okay, so let me return to the case of religious experience. As with sensory experience, we can distinguish between the good case and the bad case, right? In the bad case, the subject is not perceiving God and has no justification for her religious belief, right? Or if she does have justification, it's not because she's had the experience, right? So that's the bad case. In the good case, God actually exists and is directly present to the subject who's having the experience, right? The subject's immediately aware of God's presence. We might even say that God is an essential constituent of the experience, right? And this seems to gel nicely with some of the accounts of religious experience in which the subject describes this kind of really intimate connection with God, right? So the disjunctivist is going to say that the subject thereby has indefeasible justification for the relevant religious belief. That's to say, just having the experience, assuming she's in the good case, entails that she has knowledge of God, right? In the bad case, something else is going on, right? The subject's, hallucinating or having a seizure or something like that. And, it might be that the hallucination is indistinguishable from a vertical religious experience, right? That one might have in the good case, but we shouldn't conclude from that you don't have religious knowledge in the good case, right? Okay, so if you're in the good case, you just automatically have knowledge, your justification for your religious belief. You don't first have to rule out any other scenarios. You just have it, right? Because God is just directly present to you, right? You're not inferring that God's present on the basis of something else, right? You just have perceptual knowledge in that case. In the bad case, something else is going on. But the point is, you don't have to first rule out the bad case in order to have knowledge in the good case, right? Now, of course, none of this establishes that anyone ever is in the good case, right? So the point is just that if someone's in the good case, then her belief in God is justified, and indeed would count as knowledge just in virtue of having the experience. Right, so she doesn't need to rule out incompatible hypotheses, and no other evidence, the possibility she's having a seizure or under the influence of drugs, could end up defeating that justification. So what this application of disjunctivism allows for is the possibility that religious experience could ground religious knowledge, right? It doesn't prove that anybody actually has the knowledge. Okay, so this might be a stretch, but I wanted to end by connecting what I've been saying with a distinction that Charles Taylor makes in The Secular Age between two notions of the self, the pre-modern porous self and the modern buffered self, right? So what Taylor says is, according to the pre-modern worldview, right, the boundary between the self and the rest of the world was taken to be porous, right? So the way Taylor describes it, the self was thought to be, quote, open and porous and vulnerable to a world of spirits and powers. And this notion of the self went, hand in hand with a picture of the world as kind of enchanted, right? Full of meaning. And then when, the enchanted picture of the world was eventually replaced in modern times with a more mechanistic, disenchanted picture, at least in some cultures, the porous self was replaced with the modern conception of the buffered self, right? So instead of penetrating the mind, the disenchanted world merely causally interacts with it, right? Sort of mechanistically, right? So Taylor says, for the modern buffered self, the possibility exists of taking a distance from, disengaging from everything outside the mind. My ultimate purposes are those which arise within me. The crucial meanings of things are those defined in my responses to them. Okay, so you can see how, maybe you can see how this picture of the buffered self goes along with the traditional greatest common factor picture of experience, right, that came to be the prevailing view around the same time, right? So perceptual experiences on this traditional picture, the greatest common factor picture, occur entirely within the mind, right, buffered from the external world, right? Experiences are merely caused by things in the outside world, and anything we know about the world has to be inferred from the character of our experiences, sort of an inference from effect to cause, right? So think back to the locked room with all the TV screens, right? There's your buffered conception of the self. Okay, and so what the disjunctivist is doing is essentially recommending that we return to a more porous conception of the boundary between the mind and the rest of the world, right? We shouldn't think of the mind as somehow cut off from the outside world. Rather, in having experience, right, in the good case, we're immediately aware, right, of things in our environment, right? Those things are directly present to us. And I find it actually striking that one of the main proponents of disjunctivism, John McDowell, in a book called Mind and the World, sort of also is arguing that we should return to a kind of pre-modern, enchanted picture of the world too. So I found that interesting. Okay, so when the self was thought to be porous, it presumably seemed less surprising, right, that people could have religious experiences in which they're sort of directly confronted with God or some other aspect of the spiritual world, right? And then when the buffered conception took over, it became more natural to take a more skeptical attitude towards the idea that religious experience could provide warrant for religious belief. Okay, so that's all I had to say. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Ed Modestino. I have a lot of stuff I would like to talk about, but I may need to skim over some of the details, and if you have specific questions, I can always get back to you during the question session. So my talk is the neuroscience of religious experience. And I'm a neuroscientist, and I have dual appointments at BU, one at the School of Theology working with Dr. Wesley Wildman, and one in the Department of Neurology at the Medical School working with Dr. Patrick McNamara. My final appointment is the intersection of these two at the Institute of the Biocultural Study of Religion. We do our research primarily out of the VA hospital in Jamaica Plain. Here is the book of one of our colleagues, Dr. McNamara, The Neuroscience of Religious Experience. In our research, we specifically are looking at the neurocorrelates of religious cognition in Parkinson's disease. Now, according to Butler et al. In 2011, religious cognition refers to information processing in the brain related to one's beliefs about supernatural agents, God concepts, and the relative interaction between these perceived metaphysical entities and oneself. Furthermore, as religiousness refers to a socially agreed upon fuzzy concept set, for example, a cluster of rituals, beliefs, thoughts, and behaviors, there may be some disagreement with religious study scholars here in the audience about terms and definitions. Fortunately, we work very closely with Dr. Wesley Wildman to try and avoid that. Our research is funded by the John Templeton Foundation. This is a relatively new field, the intersection of religion and the brain. So I'll present a lot of information. Some of it is in conflict with other information I'll give, but I can only present the information of various studies. For the refinement and understanding of this will come from the continued research, which is what we're doing. Okay. So why study the brain correlates of religious cognition? One reason to study religious cognition is the role in culture. Religion is a cultural system. Local and global conflicts are fueled and healed by religious ideologies. We need to gain a more comprehensive understanding of how cultural systems can elicit and inhibit brain capacities and functions. In Dr. McNamara's book that I just showed you, he explains that studying the neurocorrelates of religious experience, well, you can gain clues as to the functions of religious experience. So brain mechanisms put constraints on theory and religion that they have to comport with the facts concerning the brain correlates. So in other words, if we find brain areas and circuits that are associated with religiosity, and we know the functions of these very same areas and circuits, it may give us clues as to the function of religion. Another reason is for patient health outcomes for clinicians. And as Butler et al. 2011 said, it's important to know the role of religiosity plays in health outcomes, cognitive decline, quality of life, decisions regarding palliative care, neuropsychiatric health, and patient compliance. And specifically for our research with Parkinson's disease, there's a need to establish whether religiosity significantly declines in Parkinson's patients and whether the change is disease-associated, treatment-associated, or psychosocial reaction to chronic neurodegenerative disease. Okay, so we know why, I gave you the reasons why we are studying this, why we justify studying it, but how do you go about studying this? Well, one way is to find brain areas that are associated with religiosity, using the techniques of neuropsychology and behavioral neuroscience. Those fields specifically look at various pathologies and clinical syndromes where there are changes in religiosity. So William James, in his Lecture 1, Religion and Neurology, within the varieties of religious experience in 1908, first gave a way to study the brain and religious correlates via pathologies. I'm going to read the quote to you here. He said, "Insane conditions have this advantage that they isolate special factors of mental life and enable us to inspect them unmasked by their more usual surroundings. They play the part in mental anatomy which the scalpel and the microscope play in the anatomy of the body." So clinical correlates of religiosity. So there are many neuropsychiatric syndromes which include changes within symptomatology. And brain changes, functional and structural, may reveal regions of interest or circuits associated with religiosity. The interest in brain correlates and religiosity seemed to dwindle after James in 1908. I guess there's a possibility that the first half of the 20th century was more focused on behaviorism, and that might be one reason why. However, there was a renewed interest in this in the 1970s when it was discovered that individuals with temporal lobe epilepsy claim to have intense religious experiences, are prone to intense conversions. So what's really interesting is that in most cases, but not all of them, people with temporal lobe epilepsy, if you give them an anticonvulsant where you're able to get rid of their seizures, often this intense religiosity that appeared with the emergence of their epilepsy diminishes, if not completely disappears. So, there have been cases of temporal lobe epilepsy in literature that suggest a relationship with religiosity. One case appeared to show that the right temporal lobe was involved because this person had temporal lobe epilepsy and they had in both left and right temporal lobes, they were having seizures. The seizures were greater in the left temporal lobe, so they removed the left temporal lobe, and once that was removed, this patient still had the heightened religiosity that emerged with the beginning of their epilepsy. Another interesting case that balances with this is a similar patient had temporal lobe epilepsy, and with the removal of the right temporal lobe, this heightened religiosity that emerged at the beginning of their epilepsy disappeared. So again, this is pointing evidence to the fact that the right temporal lobe seems to be involved with this heightened religiosity and this pathology. So despite these sorts of clinical cases and a clear association between heightened religiosity and temporal lobe epilepsy, the rates of heightened religiosity appear to be quite low. In fact, there are about 5% of those with temporal lobe epilepsy will have this heightened religiosity. So it's there. It's really interesting when you notice it. It's significant among those 5%, but for the other 95%, it's just not present. In fact, I know a physician that specifically worked out of an epilepsy clinic looking for these cases, and he had great difficulty finding them. However, because of those 5%, it's suggesting that there's some relationship between the temporal lobe and religiosity. Another pathology that shows changes in religiosity is obsessive-compulsive disorder. Now, obsessive-compulsive disorder consists of obsessions which are thoughts or ruminations. For instance, if it was religious-related, you may have obsessive thoughts that you've committed a sin. And compulsions are behaviors that quell anxiety that these people use. For instance, a person may be praying excessively with emphasis on that it needs to be perfect. So if they didn't say every word articulated perfectly, or the order or they may need to just keep doing it until it's perfect. Religious obsessions or thoughts are associated with obsessive-compulsive disorder. In the United States, between 10 and 30% of those with obsessive-compulsive disorder have these religious obsessions. In the Middle East, it's much higher. It's approximately 50%. And this suggests that there might be some cultural influence for those with OCD there. There are many subtypes of obsessive compulsive disorder. One you may have heard of are those who collect junk. They're called hoarders. Another type is called scrupulosity, and that's a pathological guilt over religious or moral issues. So here's an example of someone with this scrupulosity subtype of obsessive compulsive disorder. He became preoccupied with the thought that he had not had sufficient concentration during his wedding ceremony, rendering the marriage invalid. He went to see rabbis about it until a second marriage was arranged. So even though he was married according to his religion, he couldn't let it go. He insisted that he wasn't concentrating, and it was that bad that he had to arrange a second marriage. It was a study done with obsessive compulsive disorder patients, and it was a functional magnetic resonance imaging study, so looking at oxygenated blood flow, which is associated with regional brain differences. And these individuals were medication-free. They weren't on any medication for obsessive compulsive disorder. They created individually tailored stimuli for each person. So, for instance, there was a provocative stimulus and also an innocuous stimulus. So for someone who had a fear of contamination, this subject was given a paper towel they were told was used in a public restroom. And for the innocuous condition, to compare that to, they were given a clean paper towel, or what they were told was a clean paper towel. So it's basically the same paper towel, but it's the difference between how they're interpreting it. And so they created these individually tailored stimuli for these people. And the difference between the provocative versus the innocuous stimuli revealed both temporal lobes were activated. However, it was even more interesting. People were rating during each stimulus as to how much it affected them, how bad it was. And these ratings were later put into the model as a regressor, and this showed up that the right superior frontal activation was inversely correlated with this baseline compulsion symptomatology. So in other words, the extent of activation, the larger the measure of the compulsion, the smaller the area of activation, the right superior frontal cortex. So there's some sort of a modulation of the right prefrontal area with this. Another pathology that's associated with changes in religiosity is frontal temporal dementia, specifically the temporal variant of frontal temporal dementia. So these cases show people with severe cognitive impairments in executive function like attention or working memory, reasoning, problem solving, but also a disinhibition, failure to inhibit or impulsivity. And this is paired with hyperreligiosity. So from case studies, here are some quotes. Sudden acquisition of interest in religious ideas, texts, practices. She spent the day copying verbatim from the Bible. Religious beliefs heightened. A religious awakening led him to spend hours in church. He argued with his wife and friends regarding his new religious ideas. Interestingly, a large study was done using frontal temporal dementia, and there were two cases in it that was specifically the temporal variant of frontal temporal dementia that have this heightened religiosity. And it was using SPECT, and so it was basically looking at regional brain metabolism with this radionuclide. Those two cases showed the right temporal hypoperfusion, so a decrease in right temporal lobe activity associated with this heightened religiosity. Another pathology associated with changes in religiosity is schizophrenia. Heightened religiosity tends to be associated with the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. So schizophrenia has positive symptoms such as those that add on to a person of the average person, of hallucinations and delusions, something you gain with the illness. Whereas the negative symptoms are things like anhedonia, lack of motivation, lack of attention, no pleasure in life. But these positive symptoms of hallucinations and delusions tend to be associated with changes in religiosity. In fact, 24% of those with schizophrenia have religious-related delusions. In a sample of schizophrenics, they were asked questions about religion, and 71% said that religion did instill hope in them, but 14% said that it caused despair. 54% that said that religion lessened their symptoms, but 10% that it actually increased their symptoms. So what it's appearing like is that some schizophrenics, when they focus on religion, they're more likely to have religious delusions. A neuroimaging study was done with schizophrenia, and this used the SPECT as well with this regional brain metabolism showing activity. This person came into the hospital having florid religious-related delusions. One of the things he said is the Bible was speaking to him literally. So they gave him the SPECT scan. He wasn't taking any medication whatsoever, and it showed increased activation in the left temporal lobe. Well, actually what they did is they did this scan first while he was floridly delusional, gave him medication for a number of weeks, and when he was no longer symptomatic, they gave him another SPECT scan, so they were able to compare the two together, and that's how they came up with this increase in left. So I've suggested that some of these theories some of this pathology suggests that the right temporal lobe or right frontal, right areas are associated with heightened religiosity, but it also looks like the left maybe as well. But when I was talking about the temporal variant of frontal temporal dementia, it was a decrease in the right temporal lobe, and for this, in schizophrenia, it's an increase in activation. So perhaps it's the balance between the left and right frontal lobes that's affecting religiosity. So maybe an increase in the left temporal lobe or a decrease in the right temporal lobe are what's changing the religiosity in these people. So based on these various pathologies, Doctors McNamara and Butler proposed a model of religiosity in the brain, and I'm calling it here the pathology-based model of religiosity. They talked about the limbic system and the amygdala, which is involved with emotion, and the basal ganglia, which is a dopaminergic motor pathway, and the right temporal lobe and right prefrontal cortex associated with heightened religiosity. And they said that if the circuit is overactive, pathologies with a religious nature appear. The right temporal or left, or the balance between the two, and the right frontal lobes appear to create delusions, while as subcortical areas in like the limbic and basal ganglia create obsessive compulsive behaviors. So we plan to further elucidate this with our current research with Parkinson's disease. And our current research, which I'm going to try and go fast because I'm running low on time. As I mentioned, one of the ways to look at something like religiosity is to find various pathologies associated with changes in religiosity. And that's the methods of behavioral neuroscience or neuropsychology. So one tentative model of this is left-onset Parkinson's disease, where Parkinson's disease tends to start in either left or right. So you'll have the left motor or sort of the left side of the body having motor or some sort of motor symptom changes, and that's associated with changes in the right versus the right onset motor and changes in the left hemisphere. Those who have left motor onset and degradation in the right hemisphere tend to lose interest in religiosity. For instance, Dr. Monroe Butler, who is one of our colleagues, recently saw a patient who had devoted his whole life to religion. He was a priest, and he developed Parkinson's disease, left onset Parkinson's disease, left the priesthood, and has no interest anymore in religion whatsoever. So that's a good example for us. Parkinson's disease is a nigrostriatal disease, which means basically it's going from the midbrain areas, which are in the very center here. So the substantia nigra, pars compacta, and the ventral tegmental area, which are the dopaminergic nuclei, and they go forward into the striate on each side, which is that middle sort of crescent thing, and that's broken up into the caudate and putamen, and then it goes to the frontal lobe and even in the cingulate cortex. So this is the pathway of how dopamine is innervating the brain. So as I told you, most patients evidence a lateralized dysfunction where they either start on the left motor side, which is the right degeneration, or the right side in the left degeneration. So we want to use this as a model to look at changes in religiosity. Some studies have been done looking at changes of religiosity in Parkinson's disease. Dr. McNamara did a study in 2006. It had a very small sample size, but there was a significant difference in overall religiosity using the brief multidimensional measure of religiousness and spirituality. Interestingly, though, this study did not separate left versus right onset patients. However, two following studies did. One study by Butler in 2011 used the brief multidimensional measure of religiosity and spirituality again, and also one by Jean Quinto using the Royal Free Interview, and they both showed differences between left onset Parkinson's disease and right onset Parkinson's and changes in religiosity. So assuming this effect is real, that there's degraded access to religious concepts in left onset Parkinson's disease, why and how? And that's what we're attempting to study. So here's a list of our studies. I'm going to go over them very fast with the list, and then I'll try and go over them with a little more detail. And if you need more details, you can ask me after my talk. So here's the studies. The first one we're doing is a resting state functional connectivity magnetic resonance imaging study. And I'll explain what these are as I go through them in more detail. Another one is a religious priming experiment, which is a replication of Butler et al. In 2010. Another is a delayed or temporal discounting experiment with a religious prime. Another is doctrinal versus experiential religious knowledge, which is a replication expansion of Kapogiannis in 2009. And then these are all behavioral tasks, but they're going to be adapted for functional magnetic resonance imaging so we can find brain localization associated with this. All of these experiments will compare and contrast left onset versus right onset Parkinson's disease, both off and on medication. So the first study that I mentioned, the resting state functional connectivity, there's an interesting thing that was found that there's this, what's called the default mode network. And basically this is where most of us are most of the time. You, in fact, are there right now listening to me talk, sitting in the audience. It's when you're not doing anything that's really task specific. And there are differences in various pathologies have been seen looking at the resting state in the default mode network. So we have some theories about what we might see in the differences between left onset Parkinson's and right onset Parkinson's based on what we know of the default mode network and changes in brain degeneration associated with left versus right onset Parkinson's disease. Another study is a religious priming experiment. Subjects are primed either with a religious, civic, or neutral word before being asked to identify a phrase as sensical or nonsensical. So subjects choose if the phrase is an action that someone could actually do. So a prime is a word that's given first. For religious things, it's sacred. And then there's citizen or civic prime, as well as a housetop, which is a nonsense prime. And then there are target phrases that are given after a prime. In psychophysics and psychology, priming, the theory behind priming is that if you give, like for instance, a religious prime first, and then there's a congruent phrase that's related to religion, say as pray quietly, people's reaction times will be faster if they're responding whether or not it's an action they can do because they were primed into the concept. And we want to look at the differences between left and right onset Parkinson's. If the left onset Parkinson's can't access religious concepts, then they should not be able to do, the priming should not exist for this in the religious section. We have another experiment looking at delayed discounting with the religious prime. A delayed discounting task measures an individual's perception of value over time. Experiments is a series of choices between smaller amount of money available today and a larger amount of money available at a later time. So for example, would you rather have $25 today or $50 in 100 days? We've adapted this traditional neuroeconomic experiment with a novel priming stimulus to measure religious concepts on participants' choices. So the theory behind using a religious prime in this case is that, well, there's two things. First, that people with Parkinson's disease or have difficulty with delaying gratification, they're impulsive. So this impulsivity can be brought about by for either medications or a lack of dopaminergic inhibition of the orbital frontal region by the prefrontal cortex because of the dopaminergic degeneration. So they tend to be impulsive. So what we are hoping is that people have used religious primes to people have used religious primes to increase their ability to delay gratification. One study by Rounding, Lee, Jacobson, and Jay in 2012 showed this. There's some conflicting information, but if you get a religious prime, you're able to say, shift over sooner for the, the larger later than the smaller sooner. There's a point where you shift over, and that point of shifting over is what we think we might be able to change for those who can actually use the religious prime versus those who can't. And there may be a difference between left onset and right onset Parkinson's disease, and possibly even a difference in medication in relation to this, but we don't know. We're working on that now. And this is one of the other studies we're doing on Kapogianis et al. Specifically, he claimed to be able to differentiate experiential religious knowledge from doctrinal religious knowledge. Now, experiential religious knowledge is something through your own experience, something like, for an example phrase that we use is religion answers spiritual needs. It might be something that's from your own experience. Whereas the doctrinal is pure doctrine. It can come from a religious text or teaching. So one of the 10 Commandments, or God prohibits committing adultery, that's doctrine. Now, with Kapogianis' study showing the differences of, one was the experiential was, primarily in the left hemisphere, and the doctrinal is primarily in the right hemisphere of the brain, that people categorize things differently. The problem with his study is he had several people rate on a Likert scale of experiential being 1, 4 midway, 7 doctrinal. People would rate how they felt these phrases, where they would lie on a continuum. And the people that rated these phrases were not the people that went into the MRI scanner. A second group of people went into the MRI scanner, and they merely responded if they agreed or disagreed with the statement. Well, that's not categorization. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to improve upon this experiment, and people will actually do the rating themselves in the scanner, and will use their subject level ratings and try and bend brain images based on where they place it, instead of assuming different people see different things along this continuum. They categorize things differently. We want to know based on where individuals categorize this themselves. And so we have some theories that those with left onset Parkinson's disease, if this Kapogianis study is authentic, their results, that they won't be able to access the doctrinal concepts and have problems with showing this doctrinal circuit that Kapogianis showed. Likewise, the right onset patients will have problem with the experiential religious concepts, and they may not show the brain circuit that Kapogianis showed for that, but they will have a preserved access to the doctrinal concepts. Now, this is a theory, and we need to work on this to see what we're going to get. But in summary, it appears that the right temporal lobe regions of the brain primarily appear to be associated with religiosity, as suggested by the various pathologies I've presented. And we have a lot of studies underway to obtain more detailed information about this. And we hope that the various components of religiosity may be even more refined to local networks associated with this. So there's a lot of evidence for religiosity and brain correlates. However, some of it is confusing to interpret or contradictory to other evidence. The purpose of our research is an attempt to clarify this, and hopefully while adding something new to it. So again, I mentioned that a lot of the research of pathologies and other things were pointing to the fact that the right temporal lobe or right frontal areas or the right hemisphere was more associated with religiosity. However, I also showed you that in schizophrenia, that religious delusions were associated more with the left temporal lobe increasing. So it might be the balance between the left and right temporal lobes that are actually involved in this. This is something we need to investigate. Also, the experiential religious knowledge is primarily associated in the left hemisphere, whereas the doctrinal religious knowledge is primarily associated with the right hemisphere, according to Kapogianis. And I told you the flaws with that study. We need to go further into that. So these studies are in conflict with the right hemisphere being solely involved with religiosity. This suggests that finer subtleties in various types of religiosity need to be refined and differentiated. So that's a major goal of our large group of studies, is to do this. We hope to develop a comprehensive theory of the neural correlates, including networks of religiosity, based on the data results we collect, Most likely, this will not be restricted to the right hemisphere's involvement in religiosity, but larger networks which may dissociate subtypes of religiosity. Thank you.
First, a word of thanks to the conference organizers and to the Center for opening this space for conversation about studies of religion across the different disciplines. I think this is a great idea for a conference on religion, and I'm very happy to be a part of it. I think for everyone here, these discussions across our distinct questions and concerns might be new and productive, and they might also cast the unexamined assumptions of our own different areas of inquiry into sharper relief. And on that note, thanks to both Dr. Chen and Dr. Modestino for two very stimulating presentations. Dr. Chen's work raises questions about the possibilities, the limitations, and the importance of perceptual experience for thinking about religious experience. She uses a conceptually rigorous vocabulary for parsing ways in which philosophies of perception might warrant religious belief. Dr. Chen grounds this pattern of thought in Charles Taylor's analysis of the modern subject. One very suggestive implication of the connection drawn here is the notion that the very possibility or need for rational justification for religious belief arose perhaps in tandem with the shift from the pre-modern porous self to the modern buffered self. The implication here is that this discourse might be less necessary or even less intelligible against a very different historical or cultural background. Dr. Modestino's research on patients suffering from left-onset Parkinson's disease who exhibit reduced religiosity offers an exciting angle into a new field of inquiry. The use of brain imaging techniques to identify correlations between the activation of brain regions or networks of brain regions with religious experience, belief, and practice raises pressing questions about the implications of this research. It seems to me that this work might complement and enrich studies of the socio-political contexts of religious communities, rituals, and practices, with its insight into the physiological correlates and effects on individual sensibility and subjective states. Finally, in the willingness to focus on both states of sickness or disease and health, this research emphasizes something exemplified by William James' variety of religious experience, and that is not dismissing offhand any experience or first-hand account. This, I think, suggests that we do well to not assume we can easily separate authentic religious experience from delusion, and that even if we could, we do well to investigate ways in which the latter might be useful for understanding the former. In what follows, I'd like to highlight a few things that I find interesting or that strike me in reflecting on these presentations. I'll direct my comments in two directions, and I'll pose a question for reflection and discussion to both presenters. And in my remarks, I'll likely illustrate my own particular disciplinary commitments. But I don't think that we should strive to dissolve these differences. To the contrary, I think that our distinct concerns and assumptions can enrich our conversations. I'd like to begin by looking carefully at some of the features of the very interesting passages that Dr. Chen read at the beginning of her presentation. The first is from the life of St. Teresa. The excerpt we heard is from a chapter framed with Teresa's account of being in, quote, great pain and distress, end quote. She writes that while many prayed on her behalf, she seemed to lack a real desire to change, a testament perhaps to her sense of distress or hopelessness. In spite of this want for desire, Teresa writes, quote, I felt that I was wholly changed. I could do nothing but put myself in the hands of God, end quote. Dr. Chen read some of what follows from here. Let me reread a portion of the passage that we heard earlier. Quote, I saw Christ at my side, or to put it better, I was conscious of him. For neither with the eyes of the body, nor with those of the soul did I see anything. Let me read further. Quote, I went at once to my confessor in great distress to tell him of it. He asked in what form I saw our Lord. I told him I saw no form. He then said, how did you know that it was Christ? I replied that I didn't know how I knew it, but I could not help knowing that he was close beside me. Teresa continues, quote, I could only make comparisons in order to explain myself. And certainly there are no comparisons, in my opinion, by which visions of this kind can be described, end quote. But in spite of the inevitable failure, Teresa offers a comparison, what we might call an analogy to the ordinary, of being blind or in a dark room, and thereby unable to see another person standing nearby. But the analogy fails, according to Teresa, because in the dark room, the other senses might disclose the presence of the bystander, while for Teresa, quote, there is nothing like this, end quote. Let me turn to the second passage, this time a text included in William James' Variety of Religious Experience. Quote, God was present, though invisible. He fell under no one of my senses, yet my consciousness perceived him. The author writes, quote, "The feeling of his presence was accompanied with no determinate localization," end quote. The author tries to give an account of this presence, and he expresses a certain difficulty. Quote, "The more I seek words to express this intimate intercourse, the more I feel the impossibility of describing the thing by any of our usual images," end quote. Both of these accounts describe a sense of certainty, one that stands outside the realm of sense perception. But these two accounts are in fact quite different. Teresa's narrative of a sense of presence comes at the end of 2 years of prayer in a state of distress. The author of the narrative included in the Varieties recalls a physical and mental state of equilibrium on a trek during which he, quote, "all at once experienced a feeling of being raised above himself," end quote. While Teresa describes a continual presence after the experience, the author cited in Varieties explains that the communion was withdrawn after an ecstatic state that lasted only about 4 or 5 minutes. But in spite of these differences, both accounts hinge on the absence of sensory perception and on the failure of their language, of their analogies to the ordinary. In the now rather distant wake of one of the center's former directors, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, we're well versed in problems with the general category of religion. Interestingly, I think, American philosopher of religion Wayne Proudfoot writes that the most important ambiguity in the title of his classic work, Religious Experience, does not arise with the term religious, but rather with the notion of experience. And I'd like to suggest 2 reasons why experience is such a difficult category. First, and I think this is well illustrated in both passages, is the resistance of what we might call experience to adequate linguistic expression or communication. We could consider the writings of Friedrich Schleiermacher, in which language around religious experience is used not in an analytic or referential capacity, but rather one that's expressive or evocative. Rudolf Otto writes in his most famous text of a feeling which, quote, "evades precise formulation in words," something that, quote, "remains where a concept fails," end quote. At stake in these accounts is not only something that refuses adequate linguistic expression, but something that seems to escape the parameters of conceptual or classificatory thought. And this matters, I think, because it troubles the ease with which we can assume rational or measurable continuity. In the 2 passages, it seems that it's not the analogies to ordinary sense perception that are the best technique of communicating or conveying something of the imperceptible, but rather it's the failure or the negation of these analogies that's instructive. These experiences are characterized as standing outside the realm of sense experience, while being, as James puts it with a very clever play on words, quote, "absolutely sensational in their epistemological quality," end quote. It seems to me that the comparison in this off-sided passage between ordinary sense experience and what James calls mystical experience hinges on the notion that both yield assurance of, quote, "certain states of fact," that they're, quote, "based on evidence exactly the same in nature," quote. But this is distinct from a claim that the experiences, as opposed to the states of assurance that they affect or entail, are essentially alike. Again, in the texts, the analogies to ordinary sense perception fail, but both authors rely on them to give their accounts. This is where introducing philosophies of perception gets really interesting. So a question I'd like to raise here for Dr. Chen is how might the failures of those analogies to ordinary sense perception enter into the conversation between the skeptic, the dogmatist, and the disjunctivist? The second issue I'd like to raise is the instability and the malleability of experience. Ann Tave's 1999 work, Fits, Trances, and Visions, considers interplays between experiencing religion and explaining experience in a particular historical setting. Taves examines how a range of concepts develops between the mid-18th century and the turn of the 20th century in the Anglo-American context, and she tracks significant changes in the discourses at play. The meticulous attention to detail raises certain vexing questions. What are we to think when the range of specific terms used, fits, visions, clairvoyance, mediumship, is expanded to include new vocabulary, conversion, mysticism, and speaking in tongues? What are we to make of significant changes in understandings around the terms that persist, for example, whether they're spontaneous or induced, or how they're used as evidence, and so on? Historian of science Anne Harrington pushes the significance of these questions further in her 2008 text, The Cure Within. Harrington suggests that it's not just that conceptual terms change, but that the experiences at stake seem to change too. Consider Harrington's reflections in the context of her dissertation research on hypnosis. Quote, 18th century patients of Anton Mesmer felt animal magnetism shooting through their bodies. Patients of Dupuy-Ségur no longer did, but instead gave evidence of having access to heightened, even supernormal mental abilities. By the second half of the 19th century, that had all stopped, and instead hypnosis had become a quasi-pathological phenomenon with specific physiological profiles. She writes further, quote, "The mental and physiological experience of hypnosis, what it is changing too, and changing in ways that clearly reflect changing social expectations and mores," end quote. Harrington then raises a point that I think is really interesting in the context of Dr. Modestino's research. She writes that the experiences of the body, quote, "are likely to change over time when the rules of what counts as acceptable or possible experience change. Since in modern times, such rules are increasingly set by medical and scientific proclamations, we should expect bodies today to be listening above all to scientists or people they believe to speak with the authority of science or their doctors." So I'll end here with a question for Dr. Modestino. I'd love to hear how the patients that you work with talk about the research that you carry out. Are there notable cases that illustrate unique personal investments in the research? Or what do different people hope for or expect? Or to use a phrase that Arthur Kleinman used, what is it that really matters to the different patients that you work with? So by way of conclusion, I think Dr. Chen's study brings a certain rigor and analytical clarity to the discussion of perception and experience, a clarity that might often elude work in the study of religion. However, I think we also need to address the possibility that in achieving this sort of clarity, we compromise something of the object of our inquiry. In the text under consideration, I've suggested that the attempts to communicate something of these experiences come not only out of the use of analogies to ordinary sense experience, but also the negation or the failure of these analogies, a failure which poses the question of whether our conceptual language is, on its own, insufficient. Dr. Modestino's work raises the possibility that certain physiological features might emerge as steady correlates of religious experience over time and across cultures. One challenge seems to me to be the question of how and to what end the results of this research are integrated with first-hand accounts or narratives, and how one might meet the shifts, appropriations, challenges, and resistance posed by these accounts. Thank you.
Thank you, and my thanks to Dr. Chen and Dr. Modestino for these really interesting presentations. I found them to raise really far too many good questions and issues, and also to present us with very good but differing approaches to the topic of religious experience, which I think then funds an interesting conversation for us all here. Since we're at the beginning of this conference, I thought it might be useful to underline something that Anne said in her remarks, namely the objectives of the conference, which are, first, to foster lasting conversation, and second, to focus, and I think Anne tried to underscore this as well, to focus on translation. And I take it this means translation from scholarly idiom to scholarly idiom, or perhaps maybe better, dialect to dialect. We're all speaking English here, but maybe not necessarily the same English. It brings to mind my arrival in French-speaking Switzerland when I was 21, where I had been educated in Parisian French, which is what shows up in all the textbooks, and it turns out that I knew the verbs and the sentence structures quite well, but there were dozens and dozens of nouns of everyday, ordinary objects that I had no idea what these people were talking about. Mops, tools, anything that an ordinary person would come in contact with, it turns out had different names. And I find today's papers perhaps exhibit a similar sort of lexical differentiation where scholarly subfields and research paradigms have developed largely different methods of discussion. If we're going then to translate, it's going to be a bit of an effort, and our assumptions that we know what we're talking about are probably woefully misguided. So I want to do one set of comments that focus on the issue of translation, and then at the same time develop a bit of a thought on common bases of inquiry, which I take to be not the issue of translation, but rather one of genuine collaboration, cooperation, and common investigation and thinking. And so I take it to be that to be something we're oriented towards not necessarily immediately working out of, but I hope to address both of those in what I have to say. Now, as I turn to the presentations and proper, I have lots of things I would love to say about the details of both of them. I find them both fascinating. I read in both these literatures some and have thoughts about all of them. But I want to step back and stay focused on this question initially of translation and common investigation. Now, Dr. Modestino's paper is illustrative of a much larger research program that's going on in neuroscience, which aims to identify and discern the brain structures and dynamics which are involved in religion, specifically in the case of his research program to examine the neural correlates of religious cognition, and I underscore cognition there, in Parkinson's disease patients. Now, while there's much of interest in the detail of this discussion, a lot to talk about, for the purposes of translation between the two discourses, I want to dig into a couple of presuppositions of the research. Modestino periodically treats brain activity as such as cognition in a rather broad sense. That is, it's unclear where cognition is differentiated in talking about brain activity. The discussion of issues trades back and forth between measures of religiosity, which is maybe the more common term there, such as prayer, attending services, as well as overt religious ideation, thinking conceptually about religious ideas. All of this is in various of these studies in the field, not necessarily this piece, but in various studies referred to there. All of this is taken to be indicative of cognition. And one might infer that the presumption is that whatever the brain does is knowing or cognizing in some general sense. Or at least there's a very large subset of brain activity which is understood generally as cognition in this research paradigm. Now, there's a much wider ambit for such a notion. That's a much wider ambit for such a notion than what we use in ordinary language, and certainly than what we use in philosophy or epistemology or philosophy of religion. It's an interesting proposal, actually, and one that dovetails fairly well with where Dr. Chen's paper ended. If we are, in fact, just knowing things via McDowell's disjunctivism, it may well be that something much broader than we ordinarily think is going on. But in this research program, we see this very broad concept at work. Now, one of the strengths of this, I think, is in response and in connection with what Mara pointed out, is that such an approach doesn't overly reduce religion at the outset, at least not in terms of the scope of what's being observed at the level of data collection. Instead, it's looking at the function of the brain in a range of comparative contexts, either within the same subject or among subjects, and also between diseased and presumably normal individuals. This program has the possibility of exposing a great deal of detail about the ordinary function of the brain in the case of religion, as well as other activities, as well as the extraordinary functions, which are the ones highlighted here in terms of the extreme cases method. At the same time, such research may aid us in discriminating certain features that we didn't really necessarily think about as being separable or discriminable. Now, turning to Dr. Chen's paper, the use of an idea like cognition is actually mapped a great deal more narrowly. Cognition, in fact, doesn't appear in the paper at all, so rest comfortable in that. But nonetheless, the paper begins with claims to experience or direct awareness, occasionally labeling these as perception, and then moves quickly to the issue of beliefs and the justification of beliefs in relation to perception. Here we can think of beliefs as something expressible in propositions. The belief that there's a bowl of fruit on the table is the reiterated example. Now, much of what Dr. Chen offers us in the paper is a compact treatment of what is a fairly expansive literature on the analogy of religious experience and perception and ordinary experience and perception. But beyond that, she also steps back to a series of alternative hypotheses for perceptual or epistemological justification in the first place. We might call these alternative philosophical models. Models of what's going on in cases of experience or perceptual cognition. Among these, she identifies three: the classic model, which involves the problem of modern skepticism about the external world, which is usually brought on, by the way, by counterfactual thought experiments, or demonstrated by those. The second model she provided for us was dogmatism, which is a peculiar use of a term, by the way, for those of us who work in religion, but it's a technical term by Pryor, and he defines what he means by it, so it's not really problematic, except in the ordinary usage. The third model, likewise, is a peculiarly named thing, disjunctivism, which is coined and follows John McDowell's work. And it's actually, I should note, a more critical cut at the first modern view, arguing for what is somewhat similar to a view that others like Hilary Putnam have argued for under the name of direct realism. And these two views are somewhat similar. Perception here, knowledge, cognition isn't the overcoming of some burden. And it's not necessarily limited to cases where we are making statements as belief statements or propositional claims. Under this kind of view, experience, cognition, and the like are simply the case of our being directly aware or perceiving directly things in the world. It's a bit more amenable to a wider ambit for the idea of cognition. Now, panning back a little bit, let me begin with the obvious. Both presentations are making rather different assumptions in their research programs, and so we have to tread lightly in trying to put them together. Cognition is wide-scoped in one, rather narrow-grained in the other. But I would suggest at the outset that they're not inherently incompatible. Chen's presentation, for example, really draws attention to the question of competing models for understanding cognition, and in particular cases of religious experience or claims to cognition via religious experience, or in those cases. And it might well be, for example, that McDowell's disjunctivist critique is right, that the view of disjunctivism is right, but also that claims to religious perception are in fact not analogous to ordinary sense perception, much as Mara was pointing out that maybe the sources suggest more strongly. Even though philosophers of religion like William Alston have wanted to press this idea very strongly. It's not, however, clear at all, if one understands these closely, that we can make a lot of headway on the question of whether religious experience does or does not comport with this situation based solely on conceptual argument. Even if we might be convinced, as I'm inclined to be, by McDowell or Putnam in these cases, we still don't necessarily have grounds for claiming that the analogy is actually one of similarity or one of difference. In fact, the reports suggest that both are in play. Interestingly, though, this question is actually something that McNamara and Modestino and others pursuing this neuroscientific program might eventually be able to shed some light on. Currently, Dr. Modestino's research program is animated by a different set of questions. And in fact, the most general question, from what I could see, is getting a better knowledge of the brain and specifically trying to delineate what's going on with regard to changes in the case of religion with regard to disease. But if philosophers of perception and philosophers of religious experience are in continued conversation about this, with neuroscientists, we can presumably think about what sorts of cases and empirical situations might illuminate the underlying claims about whether the analogy between religious experience and ordinary experience, between religious cognition and ordinary cognition, between the advancing of religious beliefs and the advancing of beliefs about bowls of fruit are in fact the same kinds of functional activities in the brain or not. And it may well turn out to be that this is a disanalogy, but this is crucially something that we could look into and maybe get some headway on. We might not be able to get direct answers to that. It depends. Research design is very difficult in these kinds of cases. But nonetheless, we may get some other examples to think about that are at least as problematic or persuasive as Descartes' evil genius, or the brain in the vat, or other sorts of things. And indeed, there's a fairly wide research in neuroscience on ordinary cognition, so the interesting question would be extending that to the case of religious cognition, taking that fairly broadly, but wanting it differentiated, and then asking that question. This, it strikes me, as a good potential agenda if we were to attempt to get our members at the other table over here together in a consistent sort of fashion, because each of them have things to offer to the other, and both of them could potentially develop some knowledge in their own specific fields. Now, the second issue I wanted to raise, having offered an attempt at least at some translation and perhaps some mapping of places for collaboration, I want to turn to the question for what scope we take religious experience to have. Dr. Chen's paper began with a reference to James's varieties, and in fact, Dr. Modestino's did as well, and Mara brought it up too, in some more detail. This text has, in addition to just being something I enjoy and work on frequently, been a long-standing staple for philosophers of religious experience. I want to end by raising a couple of issues in view of the treatment in that text. First, let me mention an obvious point that's particularly relevant to our two papers today. James in that text was largely, with the exception of 3 of the 20 chapters, speaking about religion from a functional perspective. And by functional perspective, I mean to note that most of James's discussion is actually about describing and delineating the function of religion and the value and purpose of that function. James would, I should say, have absolutely loved what's going on in neuroscience. Those are exactly the kind of tools he wanted, as well as the ones we're going to have 50 years from now. He used everything at hand that he could, including taking ether himself. And the program of mapping mental states and sets of activities to brain function is in fact exactly correlate with what he did in his Principles of Psychology, where that's exactly how the enterprise was defined. And he extended that model in the case of varieties overtly in terms of laying out what the objective largely for describing the varieties of experience was. Interestingly, in varieties, the question, and this is the key point, the question of the truth of religious claims only comes up in 3 lectures and in the conclusion, which is to say that James was mostly concerned with what religion is doing in human lives, and only secondarily concerned with the question of whether, when it's doing those things, whether the people have any justified beliefs, or whether they're becoming religious through justified beliefs, which James thought they weren't, or for that matter, whether religion was cognitive in any philosophical sense at all. Now, I find this rather interesting, and also something that both neuroscience and a theoretical or philosophical model-based reflection might be able to shed some light on and think about in certain respects. James himself thought the value of religion lay in its fruits for human life. He's quoting Jonathan Edwards there, not to mention, I believe it's Matthew. But in attending to the fruits for life, he meant predominantly the transformations that he observed being effected in individuals. But also he thought these fruits of religion lay socially in its functional ability to animate our better natures. This was, from James's point of view, a spiritual judgment, a value claim, a claim about religion's ability to contribute to broader human flourishing on the whole. Sometimes in the case of the individual, sometimes not. And James, in fact, thought that these extreme cases of religious innovators, these people, 2 things he thought about them. One is he thought most of them were psychopaths and, in fact, were impaired and so would never pass the test about not having some kind of mental impairment or disease. In fact, he allowed as how most of them were détraqués of the worst sort. On the other hand, he thought that what they brought to society, and very often what they brought to their own experience through whatever this phenomenon was, in terms of what was going on in the brain, turned out nonetheless to be valuable, and that its value was independent of its validity, if we want to put it in logical terms there for a moment. So this puts a certain kind of stress on the question of how much a philosophy of perception, as it's now construed, is actually instructive if we want to think about religious experience more generally. Certainly experiences are used to talk about justifying religious claims, but religious experience may actually not be all that much about those kinds of claims. Interestingly, for James, truth, as he says in Pragmatism, truth is a species of the good. If we make one little inference there, we'll see that the good here is the genus, and in fact there are other subspecies, and of which truth is only one. It may well be that as we want to understand religion and religious propositional claims, that the analogy to ordinary cognitive or knowledge claims may not get at the bulk of what's going on in religious experience, or even in the functions that religiousness or religiosity provides. But I take it that that too is a question subject to evaluation, both empirically through things like neuroscience and also reflectively through philosophy. And I'll be quite fascinated if we could make some concrete headway on that. So I end posing not so much questions, but a couple of proposals for how we might proceed ahead. And I end in a hopeful, if not a religious state.
Yeah, thank you so much for your really interesting and helpful comments. I think one theme that seems to be coming up is, well, yeah, some of these philosophers want to argue that religious experience can justify religious belief in the same way that ordinary perceptual experience can justify beliefs in our ordinary surroundings. And the natural question comes up, but it seems like religious experience is so different in lots of ways from perceptual experience. I mean, granted, in some of these experiences, particularly the ones I was focusing on, the people having the experience describe them as, confrontations with God, or where God was directly present to them. And I think it's that kind of language that these philosophers are latching onto when they think, well, in ordinary experience, the bowl of fruit is directly present to me, that sort of thing. But granted, there are all sorts of differences too. And the question is, how should we understand those differences in this in the context of, do these experiences give us any, give the person any warrant for the beliefs that they may adopt on the basis of the experiences. Now, of course, there's some experiences that maybe don't arise, don't result in such beliefs, but seems like there may be some cases where they do. One aspect that I think Mara pointed out is that it seems that in religious experiences, the person who's having the experiences has trouble describing what's the experience, right? They can only, they try to grasp at analogies, but the analogies kind of
Ineffable.
Sort of ineffable. And I think there are different things you could say about it. I mean, one thing somebody might say is, well, there are lots of ordinary experiences that are in some sense ineffable too, right? Can you really describe what it's like to taste a pineapple to somebody who's never tasted a pineapple, right? You could say, well, maybe it's kind of similar. It's, I don't know, you can use, say some things, but you won't really be able to adequately characterize the experience. But I take it the kind of ineffability is some sort of deeper sort of ineffability. I don't know. But anyhow, that's one thing philosophers might say. Another is, particularly in the context of dogmatism or the kind of traditional religious skeptic, they might think about the differences and categorize them as possible defeaters for the belief or the experience, right? So remember, the dogmatist is going to say, well, the experience is going to give you kind of prima facie reason for the belief that's based on that experience if there are no defeaters. And then one thing that you might bring in as a possible defeater is, well, it seems like these experiences are very different from ordinary experiences, so maybe that's a reason to mistrust them, right? Anyway, so that might be one way the dogmatist might focus on it. And again, maybe more work on the neuroscience of religious experience might further say, oh, well, there are different parts of the brain that are active when somebody's having a religious experience than in the case of like ordinary perceptual experience. And then there's sort of issues about, well, how should we, suppose there are differences, how should we, I don't know, what conclusions should we draw from them, right? I think the ineffability of religious experience, I think that there poses some interesting problems for the disjunctivist account. So, at least in McDowell's version of disjunctivism, that view goes hand in hand with the idea that experience has to be conceptual, right? Because if experience can't be put in conceptual terms, how could it possibly justify a belief which is, put in terms of concepts, right? How can something non-conceptual justify something conceptual? And there's a traditional picture of perceptual experience that says, well, what you get in experience is this kind of non-conceptual stuff, and then the mind comes in and organizes it and categorizes it and forms beliefs. And McDowell is like, well, no, that can't be right, because if perceptual experiences are going to justify beliefs, they have to have the same kind of content, right? Same kind of structure. And if it turns out that religious experience doesn't have that kind of structure, right, then somebody like McDowell might be like, well, how could it justify anything? Because it doesn't, if it's ineffable, I don't know. So how can something ineffable justify something that is sort of essentially conceptual? Anyway, so those are some of the ways that I think the differences between religious experience and ordinary perceptual experience might affect some of these views. But I'll stop.
From what I heard, I think Mara basically asked me two different questions about how patients talk about research and their unique personal investment and what matters to them. The thing that I tend to be hearing often with the patients that I deal with when I'm doing the MRI scans is they're often asking me about a cure for Parkinson's disease. That seems to be their primary focus. There's not that much talk about religion. However, you did ask about firsthand narratives, and part of what we're doing is we're actually getting spiritual life experience narratives from various Parkinson's subjects. So we are directly asking them to give us narratives, and there'll be some sort of qualitative analysis of that. But we are looking at the qualitative at the subject level at their experience. For Dr. Lamberth, us scientists tend to pose direct questions within the sentence, one sentence long, and then we give direct answers. So I've tried to take notes and pull out what I could that may have been questions within what you said. The first thing is you asked if the same kinds of functional activity, religious experience, religious cognition or ordinary cognition, if they were involved with the same functional activity or not. And the answer is yes. What it appears like is the sense of self is involved with overlapping with religiosity and religious cognition. And that's short because that's how us scientists do it. Another thing is, well, religious cognition, we have, in addition to pathology of looking at, Parkinson's disease, left onset, who tend to lose their interest in religion or ability to use religiosity, and those with right onset who may not have as severe, although eventually they become bilateral and they will lose their ability as well and their interest in religion. We also have age match controls, so we'll be looking at, outside of pathology, we'll be looking at those who don't have this pathology. I think that's all I could get out of that, so. Okay.
Thanks. We have some time for questions from the audience, and since you're a large group, and I think many of you I've not seen here at the center before, if you could raise your hand, identify yourself, and tell us where you're from, and then be sure to direct your question to a specific one of the four up here. So any questions? We have about 20 minutes or so for questions. Yes.
This is for Cheryl Chen. I'm Leonard Katz, philosophy, MIT. You had said that the disjunctivists don't have much to say about the bad case, and when applying it to religion, you said the bad case, you said, well, the subject is merely hallucinating. But, back in the times of St. Teresa, I suppose her confessor might have had another really bad case in mind, which is that it might be the devil giving her this delusion, and her experience might be really counterfeit, although she might be sincere. And something similar was perhaps understood by people, including some Calvinists with a lot of scrupulosity of conscience, who were worried about justification in the sense they were concerned with, which was whether they had been saved by God's grace or were just deluded about that. And I suppose both St. Teresa and those people would have thought that the person who is really justified does really and infallibly experience justification or experience the presence of Jesus, but that in the bad case, someone might have a diabolical experience that they imagine as an experience as a religious experience. And similarly, the conceited man might think might be damned, but think he was saved. But of course, those people might not be religious counterpart of disjunctivists. They might think that, well, they might be, yes.
No, that's interesting. I mean, even in ordinary, when we're talking about ordinary perceptual experience, there are all sorts of different. I mean, I gave you one bad case, but actually there are all sorts of different bad cases, right? You might be pregnant of that. You might be dreaming. There might be these kind of hybrid cases where maybe there really is a bowl of fruit in front of me, but because of some weirdness in the lighting, the bananas look yellow, and in fact there's some other color. Maybe I'm being deceived by an evil demon, right? So I think there are all sorts of possible bad cases, right? And so it might be, in the case of religious experience, there are likewise various kinds of bad cases. One, the one I gave, God doesn't exist at all, or maybe if God does, that's not what you're experiencing, and maybe you're hallucinating or something like that. But as you say, there might be other versions of the bad case where the experience isn't an experience of God, but something more, something less pleasant, right? So I don't know how that affects the position, or.
Well, I was trying to fill out the direction in which you seem to be gesturing,
Right.
in which in other religious traditions, one might think that some types of Hindus think they actually are unified with God in a way that Christians in the Middle Ages at least worried that might be heretical. But they might think, well, some people really achieve unity with the Hindu deity, and they know it, but other people not. And those people might be counterparts to disjunctivists saying, well, we have these these people have some kind of delusion that they may put in the same words, but it's a completely different sort of beast.
Yeah, so I mean, so if you're in the good case, right, you're really in this kind of very intimate relation with, God or some other deity or something spiritual, right? But then there's a worry, like if you're in the bad case, you don't know that you're, you might not know that you're in the bad case, and you don't know that you're in the good case, right? And so there's always that kind of worry. I mean, I think the move that the disjunctivist makes, right, is that, if you're in the bad case, all bets are off. But if you actually are in the good case, then you've got knowledge, right?
So suggesting that this is actually more plausible for the religious case than for perceptual case.
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying. Right. Yeah, no, that's a nice point. Thank you.
I'm a local Christian pastor, and I'm not a scholar at all, so you may have dealt with this without my being aware of it. But what I didn't hear you dealing with is suggestions.
Are you talking?
I'm talking to all of you. I just didn't hear somebody directly. So let me give you a concrete example. Somebody comes into my church at the age of 35 who has never been part of a religious group. Without me ever saying it, the powerful suggestion is going to be that they will become religious people by being Christian and not Islam. And it seems to me that suggestion runs through everything you've talked about. And even the examples would not exist without the suggestion. Now, you guys are well above my head here. But can you respond to that idea of suggestion? Because it seems to me that that's what I would like to think that we don't do that in the church, but in fact we do it all the time. Does that make any sense? Does my question make any sense?
So is your worry about sort of religious disagreement?
No, my worry is about the people having religious experiences because the suggestion has been made that this is how you do it.
Right. Well, I mean, I think one of the things, there was a lot of work done on that in the 70s and 80s, and in multiple religious traditions. Steve Katz edited a couple of volumes on mysticism and on the question of mysticism. And from the standpoint of trying to rule that out, most of the scholars who looked at that said, no, it's actually over-determined for suggestion, meaning we have actually more examples that we can provide of why somebody is being predisposed to this by the circumstance that they find themselves in than we do examples of any novelty of the cases. And the upshot of that, scholars took that to mean two different things. One set of scholars took that to mean, oh, okay, all religious experience is actually just a product of these social enterprises, and therefore it's all, it's like deciding to be, a fan of Woody Allen movies on the basis of the fact that your friends are fans of Woody Allen movies. I mean, it doesn't really mean anything in any deep way. Another set of scholars said, no, we're not surprised by this at all. Religion is inherently a cultural and linguistic affair, but that doesn't really solve the kinds of problems that Dr. Chen's paper was raising about how do we know whether we're in the case where we have the bad conditions and the good conditions. They're not really easily differentiable from the outside. And so your point would be, once again, you're having to make that judgment from the outside if you're asking the question, are they learning this behavior and then reproducing it? That, of course, was a great issue in the first and second Great Awakenings in the United States in evangelical history. Jonathan Edwards' treatise on the religious affections, which I mentioned earlier, but Edwards finally goes through, he works through all these issues as well. He's using kind of a pseudo-Lockean framework, which is sort of the cutting edge of the day at the Yale Library down the river. He's up in Northampton. But what he comes out with there is ultimately there's nothing in the experience itself that is self-validating. And so at the end of the day, from the religious point of view, he judges the only delimiter, the only marker of true religious experience is good good practice, benefits in practice in the long run, which is, not wildly satisfying if what you're looking at is a way to take 6 people who come to you and differentiate the 2 legits from the 4 non-legits. But Edwards himself in the 1700s really didn't think there was any better way to get under this. And from the standpoint of epistemology, we're still not there, right?
So I have a question for
Would you like to identify yourself?
I'm Winnie Sullivan. I teach at Indiana University. I work on religion and law issues.
We'll be speaking Saturday morning at the conference.
So listening to you, and I used to teach evidence, so there's lots of resonances for me in terms of how evidence is judged in a courtroom from this conversation. But I am struck also by the possibility that as this research program becomes more refined, as you seem to suggest or expect or hope, that isolating particular aspects of religious activity, brain experience, brain activity, that there would be a forensic use for this. And I don't know whether you respond to that. And I'm not sure exactly what the inference was we were supposed to draw from the fact that there was a higher percentage of Middle Easterners who suffered from a particular OCD than people in the U.S. I'd be interested in what the inference was to be drawn there. But just to, and I don't want to be too overly dramatic, but this is the kind of thing that's happening today. Could this be used to show, for example, that some kind of religious brain cognition produced terrorism? And what kind of and does that seem like a reasonable possibility?
There's an entire field called neuroethics, and the University of Pennsylvania has a center for neuroethics. And people are attempting to use neuroimaging for forensic uses. They've used it a lot with sociopaths and showing they have lack of frontal lobe or this and that. Your question about whether it will be used for forensic use, it's already being used in some cases, yes.
Specifically the religious?
Not the religious, but forensic uses of neuroimaging, yes.
No, I know that.
For the religious use, not that I know of.
Are you opposed to the forensic use of neuroimaging?
No. I'm not opposed to it at all. Your other question was about why approximately 50% of those with
What
OCD.
we should draw from?
I don't know what the inference was. To me, it looked like it may be cultural. So what you seem to be immersed in your culture, you adapt to your obsession and your compulsion for OCD. I don't know that that's the case, but to me, it looked like it was some sort of a cultural difference.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Charlie Karstens. I'm a PhD student and study religion here. I would like to ask just 2 short questions to Dr. Modestino. First, I'm curious, when we locate religion in the brain, if there's any interest in determining whether the religiosity aspect is primary or whether it's secondary of some other kind of function, or whether that's an important question at all. I guess I'm curious, for example, if someone said to you, oh, religiosity doesn't really happen there, something else is happening, and then when you see religion, it's that people are turning to religion when certain conditions in the brain are actually happening. So that's my first question. The second one is just simple. It's just about the data, the current rate that we're actually accumulating data. Do you see that certain forms of data we'll be able to collect so we can say things like confidence, other things are much slower and they'll have to be anecdotal? How long will it take us to collect enough data to make certain kinds of statements with confidence? Thank you.
With regards to religiosity being primary or secondary, it appears that there's already evidence that it's primary, and it seems to be built in. It's these pathologies where it changes. So I mentioned briefly that the sense of self is involved with the same circuits as religiosity, but pathologies have a change in that. So and your question about data forms with confidence to collect enough, in all honesty, all neuroimaging is purely correlational. There is no cause and effect. We're making an assumption that what's going on in the brain simultaneously while someone hasn't, is presented with a stimulus or is doing some sort of task, that the correlation is showing what's going on. So we would need to get beyond that correlational, and I don't know about that. Okay.